I'm Conor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to episode 170 of Heavy Hands. I'm Conor Ruebusch, and today I am simply jonesing to talk about the results of UFC 214. I'm ready not only to gush about these fights on a technical level, but to ooze at the mere implications of some of these wins. My oh my, these fights, Pat, were so varied and interesting. I had a hard time just choosing one to talk about. You know what I mean? Aljo, Dr. Patrick Wyman is here, and as usual, I have borrowed his services because I feel he's one of the best in the biz. A man who, well, his reputation is simply sterling. You see that, folks? I hope you do. Pat, what do you say we vulcanize our notes, cater to our listeners, and jump into the card? Shall we?
I do not even have a response to that. That was extraordinary, sir. That was very well done.
You know what I realized while we're capping off this intro? What I should have said last week instead of the terrible thing I did say for my intro is I should have said, this is the 100th episode since episode 69, so it is nice to have our nice anniversary. I really should have said that. Something funny and interesting rather than what I did say. But here we are, UFC 214. We're very excited to talk about it. It was very exciting to watch it. Enough that I think some of the slow fights later on the main card, like they were eminently bearable and even kind of compelling to me because everything surrounding those was just phenomenal. And we're going to kick things off here. We're basically going to run through as best we can most of the UFC 214 card here. We're going to talk about the whole main card and basically the entire FXX card as well. So that's a lot of fights, but we have to dedicate the entirety of this first segment to the main event, that long-awaited rematch, the third attempt at making a rematch between Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier. It was a fascinating fight. It was a lot of fun to watch. For people like me who are big fans of Daniel Cormier, it was heartbreaking in the end, but also just, I mean, what a title fight should be. What a fight between two of the greatest in the division's history should look like. It really did have like an Ali Frazier kind of feel to me, even if it ended in a crushing fashion. Although I will say, nice to see Jon Jones getting some finishes again, too. It's nice to see Jon Jones come back and be hurting people and be reminded of how vicious his ground and pound is in particular. Overall thoughts on the fight, Pat?
I thought that this was the best that Daniel Cormier could have done, and it still wasn't enough.
That is the heartbreaking part.
Yeah, I mean, so what was really fascinating to me is both guys came out like a house on fire.
Yeah.
If you look at the strike statistics for this fight, they basically had exactly the same fight they had the first time around, just crammed into 13 minutes instead of 25 minutes.
Yeah.
Basically, they got exactly the same amount of offense and exactly the same dynamic of the fight in half the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was...
that's really striking to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people were complaining that the commentators were too excited about what DC was doing, although it was hard to resist being excited when at the end of that first round he seemed to sort of grab a chunk of that momentum and start showing off like some new boxing skills, the kind of stuff we've been saying that we were basically losing hope that DC would ever be able to develop. Came into this fight using his left hand very well, throwing combinations, hitting the body to set up the head. I think the real difference here is that while the fight was, as you said, very similar to the first one in that it was competitive, but of course Jones walked away with the win, and so maybe we can't call it close. This one did feel closer to me because the main thing we talked about last week was like the difference between the tactical approach of DC shooting himself in the foot strategically versus the strategic consistency and discipline of Jones. And this time, Daniel Cormier landed 49% of his strikes to the body and legs. There's a much better way to trade shots with Jon Jones is to be investing just about as heavily as he is in the other targets. Now, Jones did outstrike Cormier very heavily to the body, but the leg strikes were fairly close, which is nice. Daniel Cormier, somehow the first guy to really kick the shit out of Jon Jones's legs in the early going. And I don't know, there's something about the fight Cormier felt like he belonged there this time. You know what I mean? He felt like he was in the fight as a whole. He wasn't just in there trying to prove he was enjoying himself. Like, the look on DC's face in the replays when he hit that, like he knew he was about to hit a slick lateral drop on Jones in the clinch, and he just grinned and kind of rolled his eyes like, here we go, as he was throwing Jones over, shaking his head and smiling and hitting Jones back, coming forward. It was probably just enough for me to give him the second round, not enough to give him the first, but it felt like when Jones won, it was not the result of him having a firm hold on the momentum. The fight was still being contested very well by both men at that point.
See, I disagree a little bit with that.
Okay.
I think that by the time the finish came, the momentum had firmly turned. I thought the momentum turned the minute that Jones's rear end hit the stool between round 2 and round 3, and Greg Jackson started talking to him, and you could see a little flip, or a little switch in Jones's mind flip the moment that he started the third round. Suddenly, his pivots were sharper, his angles were better, his timing was better. He started sticking DC on the end of his shots in a way that he had not in the first 2 rounds. DC did not get opportunities to counter him. Jones's I think it was mostly his angles were just way better. And suddenly you could see the effect of all of the body work and leg work that Jones had done in the first 10 minutes of the fight start to take effect.
True.
So kind of all at once, after 10 minutes of what amounted to a strategic gambit by Jones, that if he fought at an incredible pace, because he was the one pushing the pace as much as DC was.
Especially at the start of every round, he came out hot. He came out looking to force the action.
He was throwing 15, 20, 25 strikes a minute for stretches of that fight, because he knew that he could keep that pace and DC couldn't. And that if he worked DC's legs and body hard enough and long enough, that eventually DC was going to wear down, and he wasn't. And he was willing, as he was in the first fight, and again, you mentioned this is the brilliance of Jon Jones. Jones is willing to lose exchanges. He's even willing to lose rounds in order to win the war, in order to win the fight as a whole. And that was exactly what he did here. You know, he took Cormier's Sunday best shots. He got into a little bit of a firefight. Cormier did a good job of pressuring him, did a good job of staying on him, did a good job of countering him, which was something that we talked about as having been a problem for Cormier in the past. Jones didn't get free shots in this fight the way that he did in the first one. Cormier stuck right with him, threw right back at him, did a great job of finishing with low kicks to catch Jones as he tried to skip back out of range.
Yeah, and a much better job of, I mean, not consistently. It's never going to be something I think it's super easy against Jon Jones, but hell of a lot better job cutting off the cage by DC. There were at least long portions of the fight in which Jones was against the fence, and there was no easy way for him to get past Cormier back to open space. There were a lot of those sequences where Cormier, those were the things we saw in the Gustafsson fight, but I think they reached a new level here. And it was really encouraging to see watching live, comparing, like we can basically talk about this fight compared to the last two fights from both of these guys. Cormier looked maybe a little out of shape, like he wasn't feeling really up for the Rumble fight in some ways, looked a little kind of sloppy. Not at all in this one. Still took big shots early, still lost that first round, but was much more in there on the striking exchanges. I think your point about Jones basically making a strategic gambit is a really strong one, because you have to wonder if like DC's words were echoing in Jones's head as he headed into this camp, saying, if I fought the Jon Jones that just fought OSP, I would have won. And I think that Jones talked a little bit about this in post-fight interviews. I mean, whether or not that's true, but Jones talked basically about being ready for there to be some ring rust, being ready for the layoff to affect him adversely. And I think his idea was to compensate for that by starting each round really fast with a ton of pressure and aggression, and to work the body, and of course, as he always does, to rely on his conditioning. To know that it might take him a little while to get really comfortable with the fight, which I think it did. But once he got there, he would still have the energy, and he made sure he would still have the most energy by, even as he was being picked apart and taking a lot of headshots from Cormier in the first 2 rounds. Like, Cormier really outlanded Jones in terms of headshots. Even when that was happening, Jones was staying to the body and legs. He was fully committed to wearing Cormier down. And
it was an attritive game plan. From Jones. And Cormier, to his credit, tried to fight an attritive game too.
Yeah.
You know, like this was, I mean, just to kind of take a step back here, like there was no better way for Cormier to fight this.
No,
it's not like there was another, and this is something we talked about at length last week. It's not like there was another game plan that was sitting out there waiting for Cormier, that if he had only done this or if he had only done that, then he would have won the fight. Like, no, he in the last fight, and especially in this one, did exactly what he needed to do, and it still wasn't enough. Like that the matchup itself was just too daunting for him. I mean, that's unfortunate, but I think it tells us how good Daniel Cormier actually is, that he was willing and able to fight up to his best self and give Jones this kind of fight, and that Jones was able to, and that Jones was just is that good that he was able to stuff that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really, really stunning to me, because you can't say a bad thing about Daniel Cormier.
No.
It's crazy that the worst thing that you can say about him, and I think the thing that's really crushing here, is that he's second best to, I would say, the greatest of all time.
Yeah, and in the end, like, watching this result, seeing the things that Cormier did in Jones's absence, seeing the things he did at heavyweight before that, it's just like a tragic story to me, because like Cormier only left heavyweight so he didn't have to fight his teammate Kane, and then Kane like basically hasn't done anything since. Like, he's had a really hard time getting back in there and hasn't panned out the way it seemed like he definitely would. Kane seemed poised to become the heavyweight GOAT. Cormier, it's not impossible to imagine that could have been Cormier. It could have been Cormier putting together this brilliant technical game, making these improvements, having some impressive rivalries at heavyweight. And then moving down to light heavyweight, he just happened to be so unlucky to exist in the same generation as Jon Jones. And
if Cormier goes back up, I could see him beating every top 10 heavyweight. Yeah. I could see his path to victory against every single one of those guys. But that's the thing.
You could also see Jones doing it, right? It's like Jones is always is always going to be there. It's like there's always this weird shadow hanging over Cormier, and it sucks because, again, like, he's a great guy and a phenomenal fighter, and he fought the best fight he possibly could have. The fact that it wasn't enough, and the fact that, like, if it had gone on 2 more rounds, we probably would have seen that it really wasn't enough. We probably would have seen more strong rounds from Jon Jones. Either way, it's just this definitive feeling that, like, Daniel Cormier is clearly great and not quite great enough. But it's only because
Cormier is going to go down as genuinely probably one of the 10 greatest fighters of all time.
Yeah, I think he's very clearly the Frazier to Jones's Ali. Very clearly.
Yeah. Which, God, I mean, any other era, no Jon Jones, and Daniel Cormier is the best on the planet. I don't know. I wrote really kind of a sad piece for Deadspin about this that will now have been up for a couple of days by the time this goes up. But it's like, you know, Cormier did everything he could. And it's unfortunate, too, that personality-wise, Cormier, I think, is such a poor fit for our era. This is going a little bit outside the technical stuff, but I just want to hit this.
That's all right. The narrative matters. The narrative matters.
I mean, I think that Cormier is a genuinely heroic figure in an age that has no idea what to do with a genuinely heroic figure.
Yeah.
That we are so inclined to see, like, earnest, like, hardworking, grinding type of guys who give speeches about the importance of hard work and dedication and perseverance. Like, we're inclined to see that as somewhere between passe and preachy, you know? But Cormier genuinely believes that stuff. And in another era, Cormier would have been a superstar and a role model for generations of kids. Yeah. But we live in the era of Walter White and Tony Soprano and Deadpool and Tony Stark. Not in an era of
Cormier's not an anti-hero. He's a regular hero. Like, the unfortunate thing, and the thing, a few other guys like Robbie Lawler, like that, it comes through in Cormier's fights too. He doesn't just believe these sort of very lofty things about, like, these human ideals. He lives them. He fights. You can see that heart and determination and mental toughness come through when Daniel Cormier performs. You really see it harkens back to, like, you know, like, gutsy performances from, like, Rocky Marciano and Joe Louis, like these classic reigns that people remember. And, you know, unfortunately, like Joe Frazier, is just always going to be overshadowed by Jones. But I think it's the job of people who are, like, in the combat sports world to tell the complicated stories about fighters' legacies. I think it's important that in boxing there are people saying, listen, I know Sam Langford never got a heavyweight title, but he's one of the greatest of all time, and here's why you need to know about him. And in 50 years, people are going to be writing, I hope, fascinating, insightful books about the triumph of Daniel Cormier, basically the tragic heroism of Daniel Cormier as a champion. And however false it may have indeed been, because Jon Jones may indeed be a sociopath, it was at least nice to hear Jones give what felt like some very kind lip service, at least, to DC as a champion after the fight.
I just want to take 1 second here to stop and think about the run that DC has been on since 2011.
Yeah.
So he knocked out Antonio Silva. Before that was a thing that everybody had done.
Yep.
He took a unanimous decision from Josh Barnett. He took a clean decision from Frank Mir, clean decision from Roy Nelson, knocks out Patrick Cummins, destroys Dan Henderson worse than anybody I think has destroyed Dan Henderson. Competitive fight with Jon Jones, beats Rumble when Rumble was looking unstoppable, beats Gustafsson, beats Anderson Silva on 2 days' notice, beats Anthony Johnson again in dominating fashion, and then goes out there and gives Jon Jones everything he has. That is a great run.
Yep.
That is a run that any fighter in any era of MMA would be proud to have. It's one of the best runs in the last 6 years.
Yeah, it definitely is. We're talking about narrative, character, personality here. I want to tie that into more of a fight analysis thing again. Going back to the fight, a thing that I sort of stumbled upon, like an idea I stumbled upon, while discussing this card with Zane Simon on the Bloody Elbow Vivisection, was the idea that maybe Jones' greatest strength, maybe, because, Jones is so fascinating. We're always shouting out that Greg Howard piece, but, like, the dichotomy of Jones, the fact that, like, Jones is the anti-hero. He is the fact that he is, like, kind of a cruel person and seems very self-interested and all this, like, in a way, it's inseparable from what he does in the cage, and that's kind of why it's so hard to, like, love or hate Jon Jones, to really have an easy feeling about him. Why he's so compelling is that these good and bad qualities, like, they have to coexist for Jon Jones to be Jon Jones. And I think one of the biggest things throughout Jon Jones's career has been the fact that his opponents are frequently emotional. Whether it's, like, in the fight itself, oftentimes he's making them uncomfortable. Jones is always investing in putting pressure on you, stealing little opportunities to hurt you or scare you every single opportunity. It's almost like Jones, even when he's on the outside, his opponents are always... He's always got the initiative in some sense. He's always directing the fight because the other person's made to fight on instinct or to worry about things or be anxious, and Jones is just leading the fight. And this was the first time since the Gustafsson fight, which we know Jones, like, barely prepared for and was not really in top condition for that bout. This is the first time that I saw somebody go in there and, I think Cormier ended up waking Jones up by accident by suddenly having such a firm hold of the momentum in the middle of that second round. Like, when he was smiling and dismissing things and coming forward, there was a moment where Jones was playing with him and the smile left his face. And he was like, oh, like, he's doing to me what I do to other people. Like, he's giving me this vibe, like, I'm not in charge, like, he belongs here and I don't. The smile left his face, he realized it, and he went back to the corner, and Greg Jackson said, don't do this buddy-buddy stuff. We're not shaking hands and having fun and brawling with this guy and exchanging punches. We're going to beat him. And so he came out more collected and went back to being Jon Jones. But the fact that DC was able to go in there and, like, enjoy himself genuinely and sort of play with Jon Jones and look like a defending champion, at least in glimpses, I think is a great kind of note to leave the title run of DC on, because the big problem in the Jones fight the last time around was that he was so emotional. He was so focused on the trees, basically, that he had no idea he was standing in the middle of a forest. He lost the fight because he was so eager to teach Jones a lesson, and it didn't feel that way this time.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that is absolutely right, because I think the guys who have had the most success against Jones are the ones who are able to just go out there and let it flow.
Right.
And not worry so much about what Jones is going to do to them, focus on what they can do to Jon Jones, but based on a deep understanding of what Jones is capable of, right? That, I think, is what allowed DC to do that, was that he'd been in there with Jones for 25 minutes, and he'd spent years preparing for Jones and thinking about Jones. Mm-hmm. And he didn't, when you get into the fight, when he got into this second fight, Daniel Cormier didn't need to think about Jon Jones anymore. Like, he knew what Jones had to offer. He was aware of what the challenge was that was in front of him. That was what was really striking to me last summer when I talked to Daniel Cormier before they were scheduled to rematch at UFC 200, was like, he had no illusions about Jon Jones. He wasn't underestimating Jones. He knew exactly what he was capable of. You know, he was almost a little too resigned to what Jones was capable of. That he knew that he didn't. You can't get in there and overthink yourself when you're fighting Jon Jones, because Jones can always think faster than you. He can always react faster than you. Yeah. He always has a better understanding of your game than you have of his game. You can't get into that kind of fight with him because you're never going to beat him there. And you can see guys who have done that. It happened to Lyoto Machida when they fought. When Machida was just reading and reacting in the first round of his fight with Jon Jones, he did great. The second Jones gave him something to think about, the fight was over.
Right.
With Rampage Jackson, Rampage came into that fight flummoxed and never got any offense going the entire fight. Shogun came out there not really knowing what to expect from Jon Jones and got just his ass beat from the opening bell. Yep. You know,
like, Rashad even
you
like
can't. Yeah,
we. I mean, go on.
Oh, so Rashad did okay up until the moment where he had to start thinking.
Yes,
and the moment that he had to start thinking, the fight was over.
Yeah, and I think maybe like going forward, that's going to be the thing that feels like the key to Jones' success to me, is recognizing that I've always given credit to his stamina, as does Greg Jackson. Greg Jackson, I think, said, you know, like, that's his athleticism, is that he doesn't tire out. He keeps fighting his ass off longer than anybody else. But it's like Jones, if you look at his career and how his fights have gone, especially as he's warmed up to his title, his championship reigns now, he's a momentum fighter. He's like a snowball rolling downhill. And we see a lot of early rounds in which things are being figured out, but no one ever takes the last round of the fight from Jones, whether it's because he finishes them in the third or he wins on points in the fifth. No one ever takes the last round. By the end of the fight, Jon Jones is fighting his fight. And emotionally and strategically, it was nice, even if a little tragic in the end, to see Daniel Cormier thinking of himself, fighting for himself, rather than chasing this sort of white whale in Jon Jones. Obviously, those feelings were still there after the loss, was heartbroken. But maybe we can end our discussion perhaps by saying that Cormier's words, I guess his tragic words, if the other guy wins both fights, there is no rivalry. I don't think that's true. I think that Cormier, whether it's bittersweet to be in sort of a subservient role in the history of this division to Jones, or in a second fiddle role, he has elevated Jon Jones. He has emphasized the greatness of Jon Jones while being really great himself. So, yeah, it was a good fight, man. It was good to see Jon Jones back. Good to see Jon Jones having to overcome some adversity, but doing it with aplomb, doing it with a lot of composure, and showing what really makes him special that he doesn't get appreciated for enough, which is just his decision-making, his intelligence, and his discipline in the cage. Outside the cage, no discipline whatsoever. But in the fight, nobody controls the initiative and their emotions and maintains discipline like Jon Jones. He is up there alone with Demetrius Johnson in that regard. Nobody else is like that cool and collected in a crazy fist fight with the best version of Daniel Cormier ever. Nobody but Jon Jones.
Yeah, well, I think there are three guys that we can talk about in this. There's Jones, I think, is pretty clearly the best of all time, especially considering the quality of competition he's faced. In that regard, like, it's different making those kinds of mid-fight reads and adjustments against a barreling forward Daniel Cormier than it is against John Moraga, or a raw Kyoji Horiguchi or something like that.
Sure.
Like, DJ may actually be the best, but Jones has gotten to prove it against the best.
Right.
And then Dominic Cruz, I think, is the only other one who even deserves to be in that conversation. It's those three guys, and everybody else is miles behind them. So, I mean, but to me, that was what this fight proved, was that Jones really is. He really is everything he's been cracked up to be. He really is the greatest. And the sky is the limit at this point. If he wants to go fight Stipe Miocic, I think he's a 2-1 favorite over Stipe Miocic. If he wants to fight Brock Lesnar and give him a matching scar on the other cheek, I think he can certainly do that. I do not think at this point that you could pick a single fighter in all of MMA where they go out there and you're like, you know what, I think that guy's going to beat Jon Jones. Yeah. I don't think there's a single fighter in MMA history that you could go out there and feel comfortable with.
And as a legacy-defining fight for Jones, again, there is a rivalry. That there has been a rivalry, and that's part of what lets us know how amazing Jones is. It's why he gets to be ranked above DJ, because of the rivalries that he's had, and will probably continue to have if he comes back to light heavyweight. I mean, Gustafsson is still there looking for a rematch. There are still options, and I always upset people when I say this, but for me, Jones is head and shoulders above Anderson Silva in terms of like all-time pound-for-pound rankings, and it is specifically because of stuff like this. Jones has a really, really worthy opponent in Daniel Cormier, the second greatest guy in his division's history, probably, fighting at the same time as him, and he beats him 2 times. That kind of stuff really cements Jones as the light heavyweight GOAT, and with me, he's neck and neck right now with GSP for all-time MMA GOAT as well. So it's pretty remarkable. Remarkable things happening at UFC 214 in, where did this fight card take place? Anaheim, California. Disneyland, Pat.
Yeah, the Honda Center is a lovely venue. There are great bars right across the street. It is a fun place to see a fight.
Pat has just received a check from the Honda Center, and I've received a check from the Disney Corporation. And on that note, we will take a break. When we come back, we are going to get briefly into the next 2 fights in this card, because while I think they are meaningful and there are things to say about them, they are pretty simple to understand from a technical level. We're going to talk about the title defense of Tyron Woodley against Damian Maia. We're going to talk about the title win of Christiane Cyborg Justino over Tanya Evinger. And then we're going to start to get into Robbie Lawler versus Donald Cerrone. All of that in the next segment. All of that after this break.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Tyron Woodley defeated Damian Maia. Interesting statistic about this fight in the process, and also because he happened to be fighting on the same night as Renan Barão, who gave up his first UFC takedown on this card. Tyron Woodley now has currently the best takedown defense in the UFC. Damian Maia tried a lot of times to get him down, could not do it. Slow fight, but Woodley very clearly winning it against a very game Maia, but starting to feel like this is the pattern of Tyron Woodley's fights, is that Tyron Woodley is in many ways a negative fighter, a fighter who builds his fighting style around things he does not want to happen, whether it's gassing himself out, getting caught in an exchange, or getting taken down by a phenomenal jiu-jitsu player. Tyron Woodley is the opposite of what we usually see from great fighters, where we always say, like, you build their confidence, you tell them what they're going to do and not what they can't let happen. But that's Woodley. He knows what he doesn't want to happen, and that's how he wins his fights. And I honestly find it kind of fascinating, even if the fights aren't really that fun to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Woodley, we will end up looking back on him as a somewhat fascinating figure once his era has passed.
Yeah.
As this era is happening, it is insufferable to watch. Like, I mean, I like Tyron Woodley as a person. We have interviewed him on this show. I think he's exceptionally intelligent in terms of the way that he fights, in terms of the way that he game plans, the way that he approaches things. I think that that does not equate to him being a fighter that whose fights I have to see, or whose fights are that interesting in concept or execution.
Yeah.
I think you're right that he is kind of a negative fighter. But what gets me about this is the contrast between somebody like Woodley and somebody like Jones, where Jones is an exceptionally safe fighter in the sense that he is always putting himself in the best position to win fights, because winning fights is safer than losing fights.
Everything is strategically motivated from both of these guys, but in with their very different executions.
Exactly. Like there is no risk for Woodley that can be calculated.
Yeah.
You know, whereas Jones is perfectly willing to make strategic gambits which is what's so frustrating to me about this. And Demetrius Johnson too, this other exceptionally intelligent strategic fighter, is perfectly willing to take risks.
Oh, yeah.
And do things that may get him hit or taken down or put in a bad position, because he knows that they are going to give him the best chance of winning the fight as a whole. And winning the fight as a whole is what keeps you from getting choked out or getting your face plastered all over the canvas, or losing your title and ending up in a worse financial position.
Yeah.
Like, at some point, and I said this after the fight, and I mean it, Woodley is going to beat himself,
yes,
and he's going to regret it.
Right. Maybe is this the difference? People like Jones and Demetrius Johnson are always doing something to ensure the best chance of winning, even if that means taking a risk. Tyron Woodley is always doing what he can to avoid losing. He is, like, that's the difference, is that both guys are thinking about the fight as a whole, what they can afford to do, what they can't, and how they should be directing their energy against a specific opponent. Like, you can't fault Tyron Woodley for saying, look, I trained a lot on not getting taken down for this fight. The man stuffed, 22 takedowns from Damian Maia? And by the end of the fight, they were beautiful, effortless stuffings of those takedowns. Woodley was, like, just throwing Maia around. Maia, a big, strong welterweight, by the way. Like, even against Woodley, his size came through in this fight. But in execution, like, if you're Tyron Woodley, someday you going out there, like, almost here, you know what I mean? There were moments Maia was landing straight lefts. Not at a good clip, not enough to win rounds, but I actually kind of enjoyed what Maia was doing because he was gambling. You know what I mean? Like, Maia was in there gambling to win the title. He was in there taking chances and thinking, you know what? I can't get this dude down, but he's worried about the takedown. I know that. I'm going to hit him. And even in that, Woodley may have given a bad impression to the judges on a few occasions by reacting to every single shot that Maia landed, letting everyone know that Maia was catching him with some pretty good, clean, straight lefts from time to time. Woodley was not in there gambling. He was in there avoiding gambles at all costs. And while I think that makes him like a compelling figure in a certain sense, it certainly does not make for fun fights. I ended up enjoying this one because of the card surrounding it. It didn't bum me out that it was so slow. I was at least interested because of the little things that Maia was trying to do, and I was like, I went into it with a, well, you know, who knows, anything can happen vibe, but that's a very optimistic way to approach a fight, and I would never say that most people have a responsibility to give Tyron Woodley that benefit of the doubt. It's you should not watch a fight and like convince yourself that you're enjoying it, and it's hard to do that anyway with these performances Woodley's been putting on. So, yeah, kind of a weird thing. Any more thoughts on that one, or should we move on?
So I think the one kind of mitigating factor is that apparently Woodley hurt his shoulder throwing a right hand early.
Okay.
And so apparently he couldn't sit down and do what he wanted to do, but I think he would have fought that pretty much exactly the same way if the Thompson fights are anything to go by. Like, yeah. I don't know that him having a fully functional shoulder would have really changed the dynamics of the matchup all that much.
There were glimpses, man. Like in round 2, he came out, he took the center of the octagon, he put a little pressure on Maia. Like, Woodley's good at that stuff. Like, Woodley coming forward and cutting off the cage and, like, feinting to set up his shots, he's really good at it. But it's like he doesn't have the mental endurance, or maybe he fears not having the physical endurance to do it for more than, like, 30 seconds at a time. And then he just kind of falls back into what he's comfortable doing. It is frustrating and strange. It's he's a very unique fighter, Tyron Woodley. Like, there's nobody else who's achieved this level of success with such a negative style of fighting.
Yeah, I mean, I so dearly want to like Tyron Woodley as a champion and as a fighter. I want to, because he's a great guy. I think he's a great role model for kids. I think he's an incredibly hard worker. I think he has done fantastic things to put himself in the position that he's in now. I think he gets it. I think he gets how the game works. But this is just it's just awful to watch.
Yeah. Oh, one final thing on it though. I do want to say Dana White is just really taking the cake for burying his fighters lately. Demetrius Johnson and Amanda Nunes first. Now Tyron Woodley again. Listen, I get it. There is no way that we as analysts can sit here and say, boy, that Tyron Woodley fight sure was fun. But if I'm Dana White, like, You can sell Tyron Woodley being a terribly boring fighter if you try. You can do something. Your job as Dana White is not to like try to curry favor with the fans to make them like you by saying nobody wants to watch Tyron Woodley fight and they all clap and agree. Your job is to say, listen, if you think that it's boring to watch him fight, go in there and beat him. The guy's in there. He's unbeaten. He makes people look bad and doesn't really seem to have to try that hard to do it. Like, there's something you can spin it to make Woodley like a spoiler and at least make people want to see him lose, right? You have an unlikable guy. You can make people want to watch him lose.
So here's the thing about that. Like, Dana White has shit on so many fighters for so long, for so many years, that he is the boy who cried wolf. That, from my perspective, if there is something real bad happening with a fighter or with a champion, if there's somebody you're real mad at, like, I think that White, to some extent, actually has a point here. I think that people are not going to pay money to watch somebody who does the things that Tyron Woodley does.
Sure.
And I actually don't think, as much as I don't like the idea of White shitting on his fighters, because I think it's not, he's the promoter, and that's not what
it's
a promoter is
obviously
supposed
bad
to
promotion.
Do. Yeah. But with that said, given White's overall orientation and his role within the UFC, which is not quite the same. He's not Bob Arum. This is not quite the same. This is not quite the same thing as fight promotion, fight promotion. With all of that said, if he had just saved it a little bit, like, why do you need to go shit on Mighty Mouse?
Maybe then it would mean something, and you could build a narrative with Woodley when you do shit on him.
That's my whole point. Is like, you can't. You need to pick and choose like one fighter a year,
right? Because
that
like.
Shit on. And
Tito Ortiz, back when it was novel that Dana would have a spat with fighters, that made Tito Ortiz more compelling because he didn't like his fucking boss. He didn't like his promoter, and Dana White didn't like him. So it made it like you were going to show up to weigh-ins to see Tito wearing his Dana is my bitch, and I believe Dana is gay t-shirts. Very early 2000s attire from Tito Ortiz. But that was interesting to people at the time. Those were the fights that kind of got people interested in MMA again, in this country at least. But I think you made a good point. Like, if you're shitting on everyone all the time, including the greatest fighter in your organization, or at least the second greatest, up there neck and neck with Jones and Demetrius Johnson, no one even cares when you talk shit about Tyron Woodley. It just becomes bad promotion rather than like an interesting gambit to make people interested in the negative aspects of your champion, you know? Yeah, I think I'm with you there.
It's deeply frustrating.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to something a little less frustrating, though certainly no more competitive, less so, by a pretty big margin. Chris Cyborg won the UFC women's featherweight title. Would have been real funny, Pat, if Evinger had won this fight, just because it would have meant that two non-featherweights were the only women to ever hold the UFC's featherweight title. But Evinger did not win. In fact, Evinger did not come remotely close to finding an opportunity that could have been a win. Cyborg took her apart, and made adjustments to take her apart more smoothly and easily in the second and third rounds than she did in the first. Just really patiently, maybe not the most exciting win she's ever had, but very intelligently beat the shit out of Tanya Evinger.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I think that there are two ways of looking at this. And I think from our perspective, this was a dominant, masterful performance by Cyborg. Yeah. She did everything that we have come to expect from her in terms of not punching herself out, in terms of picking and choosing her spots, doing a fantastic job of setting her range and distance, and really controlling the initiative of the fight. So Evinger is at her best when she's kind of barreling forward and forcing you into a grimy, muddy kind of fight.
Yep.
And Cyborg masterfully avoided that.
Yeah.
Like, not through her physicality, but through her technical skill, through her footwork, through her ability to set the distance with her jab, carve up Evinger's legs with low kicks, and then pick and choose her spots to sit down on big punches and knees.
Yeah.
So she, at no point did she overextend. She never panicked. She never got herself out of her rhythm. Like, that was as complete a technical performance as we have seen from any women's MMA fighter not named Ioana Jędrzejczyk.
Yeah, if there is any performance that could corroborate all the praise we have been giving in the last year or two to Cyborg's technical prowess and not just her physicality, then it was this one. Against an opponent who simply refused to be knocked out, Cyborg got to show her speed, her fluidity, her head movement, her counters, the variety of her punches, her angles, her cage cutting, everything was on display. Everything that makes Cyborg a great technical fighter, everything that makes her not the behemoth who can be tired out and out-wrestled or whatever like people think she is, was on full display in this fight. She really just boxed the ass off of Tonya Evinger. She really took her apart. The jab, the left hooks, the counter right hands, like knowing where Evinger's head was going to be as she was throwing those straight right. It was just a pretty sublime performance. Unfortunately, not competitive in the slightest. The only thing that made it remotely competitive is the fact that Evinger just can't be killed. But as far as like technical domination, this is the kind of shit that we wish Tyron Woodley was doing to his opponents. You know what I mean? Like going out there and throwing just enough strikes to be in control, use your speed, don't wear yourself out, neutralize, but then take over. Cyborg did that with aplomb. So a very impressive win from her. Was there a negative side to this? I sensed a but in the first thing you said about, for us, it's about her technical proficiency, but do you feel that maybe this isn't the fight that people need to see from Cyborg to get excited about her?
Yeah, so that was going to be the flip side to this. Is like if what you expect from Cyborg is a whirling dervish of destruction, then she did not provide that for you. And I think that there were people who were like, well, how come she couldn't just beat the crap out of Tonya Evinger and end it in the first round? She was in control. Like, because that's dumb. Because that's a dumb way to fight somebody with Tonya Evinger's skill sets.
Yeah.
And Cyborg is many things, but she is not a dumb fighter. And Cyborg was not going to go out there and put herself in a position to get sucked into a nasty, mucky, grinding fight with Tonya Evinger, which is exactly the only way that Evinger could have won that fight.
Yeah.
Was in that way, shape, or form. It's not like it was unentertaining. Cyborg landed a ton of shots. She landed like 75 strikes.
I was expecting Evinger's head to fly off every 20 seconds. Like I really was. Like I was engaged. I was biting my nails. I was worried for Evinger because Cyborg was in there outclassing her and also just hitting her with crushing shots, like on a steady pace, just hitting her consistently throughout the fight as long as it lasted.
This speaks to my personal theory about MMA right now, is that we are spoiled by pace.
Yeah.
The pace has gotten so much quicker, so fast in this sport that we can no longer appreciate a genuinely quick-paced performance, because to land 75 strikes in 11 minutes should stand out to us as an extraordinary accomplishment from a big-time power puncher like Cyborg to maintain that pace.
While taking how many shots in return? How many did Evinger land?
32. I mean, and most of them were kind of piddly little low kicks.
75
and
mostly
like
clean, cracking shots versus 32 mostly glancing blows.
Yeah, I mean, like we are now spoiled. We can't appreciate it when we see this in front of us. So all I can say is props to Cyborg. She is everything she has been cracked up to be. She is an extraordinary fighter. She deserves all the credit. There is nobody fighting at 135 or 145 pounds who is capable of touching her.
Yeah, she really is a marvel. We have Robbie Lawler and Donald Cerrone to talk about, but we're probably nearing the end of what should be our second segment. So let's say we take a break. When we come back, we're going to try and invest a good amount of time into Lawler Cerrone because it was fascinating and everybody loves Ruthless Rob, Brutal Bob, and Cowboy Cerrone, of course. And then we are going to run through the final 5 fights on our docket here, that being Ozdemir Manoa, Lamas Knight, Sterling Barao, Ortega Moicano, and a little shout-out for Calvin Kattar, who did a remarkable thing in overcoming plus 300 underdog odds to beat Andre Fili in his UFC debut. We're going to talk about all of that and more after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
And we are back. Robbie Lawler, Donald Cerrone. It has been just about a year, maybe a little more than a year actually, since Robbie Lawler lost his welterweight title to Tyron Woodley. Shout out, by the way, to Tyron Woodley for defending the title pretty frequently. For a guy who was so severely criticized for thinking about taking that GSP fight, which, by the way, would have made a lot more sense than Michael Bisping taking a GSP fight, but that's, I digress. Tyron Woodley's actually been really active as a champion. Lawler, in the meantime, I think has taken some much-needed time to recover. I think it would have been a mistake for Robbie Lawler to pull a Donald Cerrone and experience a crushing loss and then try to come right back in there. Instead, he took Kami Barzini with him down to Combat Club to work with Henry Hooft. I know that was heartbreaking for Joanna Champion when Ariel Helwani so cruelly reminded her that Kami Barzini was leaving ATT. But Lawler, I think, came in here and looked more focused. He'd refocused on the stuff that made him a championship contender when he returned to the UFC a few years ago and looked pretty good, but still had some of those trouble spots that sort of haunted him and made those classic title fights a little more difficult than maybe they had to be. What did you think of his performance?
I thought that Robbie Lawler is fairly clearly not the fighter he was maybe 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think this cemented the impression of kind of an ongoing decline for me.
Yeah.
But I don't want that to be the lead here, because the flip side to that is that he has just gotten craftier and craftier and smarter and smarter. And when you are as athletic and powerful and quick as Robbie Lawler was, you have a lot of rope before you run out in terms of physical decline. Like, Robbie Lawler can be not the physical specimen he was in 2014, much less 2005, and still be a good enough athlete to compete with the elite welterweights. So what he has gained in that time is smarts, like smarts upon smarts upon smarts upon smarts upon smarts, all of which he put to use in fighting Donald Cerrone here. That was about the most intelligent fight from both guys that we've seen either fight, and both are smart fighters. You know what I mean? Like,
it's a very good point. Really striking here. From Lawler, tons of pressure early. Just come out there, try to take Cerrone's head off. It works, right? It at least means you'll probably win the first round while he recovers, if he survives. He did. Survived pretty admirably, in fact, and landed some good shots in that round, but Lawler pretty clearly took it. And then Lawler had this period in the round 2 where Cerrone made the adjustment. Cerrone was getting comfortable and started throwing beautiful combinations. I mean, just sublime, creative, organic combinations from Cerrone. The kind of stuff we've really only started seeing to this degree since he began working with Brandon Gibson, and really not even this well since he moved up to welterweight. He kind of figured out that if he was mixing up his strikes, if he was working his leg kicks, his side kicks, keeping Lawler a little farther away, then he could sort of confuse Lawler's timing, because it was clear that after the initial rush, Lawler fell into his instinct to counter, and Cerrone kind of froze him. Lawler wasn't throwing much in round 2 because Cerrone was putting 4 and 5 strikes together, ending with his kicks, ending with the strikes that Lawler has always been most susceptible to. And then how about Henry Hooft, Pat? Henry Hooft, well known for his discouraging corner work. I expected that Lawler would look good anyway, because I don't think he's a man whose confidence is easily bruised. But in the corner, this is what Henry Hooft said to Robbie Lawler. He said, stop worrying about what he's doing. Don't worry about what he's doing. You fight your fight, essentially, paraphrasing. That's what he said. That's some Rafael Cordero shit. Like, that's good corner work. He was like, listen, go out there, let your hands go, put the pressure on him. You'll see. He's only dangerous when you are thinking about what he might do to you. When you're thinking about what you want to do, you can beat his ass. And so he came out third round, kicked the hell out of Donald Cerrone's body, which is also exactly what you should do when you fight Cerrone. And I thought pretty clearly won the third, even though it was close on strikes. I thought Lawler landed the power. So
so that was something that was really interesting, is I think that this is a fight where the strike statistics are a little bit misleading, because what you end up with is an impression that Cerrone landed a lot more and a lot better than maybe he actually did. I think especially in that second round. Yeah,
and also in that third, they showed those fight metric stats. Cerrone had like 30 strikes to Lawler's 29. I felt like he really didn't land 30 strikes in round 3. I felt like Lawler's defense was really on point in that round.
So that's what makes Robbie Lawler decisions, fights that go to a decision for Robbie Lawler, kind of hard to judge in his evolved form. What we've seen from him basically since the first Johnny Hendricks fight is his defense is not predicated. It's not Anderson Silva. It's not okay. Dogs are just losing their minds here. Sorry,
big Anderson Silva fan. Lucy got very excited at that name. Robbie Lawler's defense is not of the Anderson Silva type or the Jose Aldo type where you are just missing him entirely and looking silly doing. Yes.
Robbie Lawler's defense is based around taking the sting off your shots, making it hard to hit him cleanly, even as he's operating in ranges that are pretty dangerous to be in.
Yeah.
So he's really good at rolling with shots and taking a little bit off them, at partially blocking or fully blocking shots, at parrying a little bit, at doing just enough to make it so that you're not hitting him hard enough for it to matter at all. And so the shots that when Cerrone would throw 3, 4, 5 shots upstairs and it would kind of look like they'd land, if you watch them on slow motion, I went back and watched a lot of the second round and Cerrone's combination work to the head slowed way down. They weren't landing enough to be telling shots. Yeah. You know? So even as Lawler was more or less giving away the second round, he only threw 23 strikes in the second round, fewer than 5 strikes a minute. Well, Cerrone threw almost 70 strikes that round.
Jesus, yeah.
Like, if that disparity was not as much as it seemed like on paper.
In terms of effectiveness.
People are like, oh, that was kind of almost a 10-8 round. I'm like, he didn't really land a lot that was really all that big.
It was a clear 10-9, but no more than that. That's a very good point. Like, Lawler's defense has often been what makes him – he's super dangerous when he's hurt or when you're attacking him, and it's always been in part because of his defense. He and the guy we'll be talking about at the very end of the show, Calvin Kattar, both examples on this card of a high guard done well to mitigate damage in close. Lawler – in the second round, like, the strikes were getting through here and there. It was the fact that Cerrone was throwing such layered and varied combinations that did allow him to win that round just by flurrying the way he was. But in round 3, it was a lot easier to see, even as everything was playing out at full speed, that Robbie Lawler was catching Cerrone's punches on his forearms and gloves, that he was moving his head away from shots that did land, and that the ones that connected mostly were bouncing off his forehead. Like, it was very clear to see that once he got Cerrone's reads and decided he was going to go in there and make it a fight again, and put the pressure back on him, work his body, all this stuff, that he was ready for what Cerrone was throwing at him. And it did feel to me in this fight that once, even though Cerrone had moments in round 3, once Lawler was picking off Cerrone's counters and responding and staying close to him effectively, like not being backed off, not taking a kick at the end of the combo, once he had figured out what Cerrone was going to show him, the fight was his again. I felt he took a firm hold of it in round 3.
Yeah, so the thing that Lawler eventually did, this was the adjustment that was most striking to me, was early in the clinch, that was all Lawler. Yeah. Then Cerrone started to figure things out. He started to figure out what Lawler was doing in terms of head positioning and digging for underhooks. He figured out where the openings were for his elbows and knees. He figured out how to get his hips back and create space to land really damaging shots. Lawler's adjustment to that was when Cerrone started looking for the clinch instead of Lawler. So at first it was all Lawler diving, just barreling headfirst into the clinch. Then eventually it was in the second round, it was Cerrone who started looking for the clinch. Lawler's adjustment to that was brilliant. Instead of either just trying to get away as much as possible, which would have meant giving Cerrone the long distance that he wanted, or diving forward and thinking, okay, I'm just going to go head to head with this guy inside and beat him there. What Lawler ended up doing was taking really short steps backward, really short adjustment steps, and throwing combinations as he did it. So he would angle off, just take a short step backward, angle off, and then throw usually some combination of an uppercut and a hook off of either hand. And just trying to there weren't big shots, they weren't knockout shots. He was just trying to score and land around Cerrone's guard when Cerrone was vulnerable at close range. And those little short shots, he landed probably 6 or 7 of them, were what won him the fight.
Yeah. I also think we can tie this back into some of what Daniel Cormier did. He also had some really brilliant moments of this. Another response Lawler had when Cerrone started to realize that when Lawler was just barreling into the clinch, he could get an angle and find the elbow. He could land hard knees. Lawler took those short steps back. Sometimes he didn't throw those. Sometimes he accepted the clinch. Like, there was no choice. Cerrone was barreling forward, but he would change his level. He'd keep his hands inside, get good head position, and just get a look at Cerrone. He wasn't in there in tight, just swinging away. He had a nice angle secured by his head control and got a look. Made sure that Cerrone's hands were out of the way. He wasn't going to catch any shots from above that he couldn't see, and he could prepare for whatever knees and at least determine if he should hang out in the clinch or not. I also saw some instances of that from Cormier, like separating, allowing space between your hips, not smothering your work, looking at the clinch, seeing it, using... Vision is one of the hardest things to have in the clinch. It's what makes infighting so much different from outfighting. Everything is kind of feel and tactile response, but... The best infighters in history, like if you read, is his name Frank Klaus? He wrote a book on infighting like in 1908. Frank Klaus, I think, is the name. He also talks about that. There's images in that book where he gets low, he controls a wrist, and he can see the whole body of his opponent from that low angle, while they get to only see the top of his head. So he has the advantage even when there's no strikes being thrown. He can at least make the decision to press or disengage. I thought there were some really nice adjustments from Robbie Lawler. It'll always worry me when he lets a round go by and his opponent is just throwing a million kicks at him and he's just sort of hesitantly waiting for one punch. But it was really nice to see that in a 3-round fight, round 3 Robbie Lawler is almost as good as 5th round Robbie Lawler was during the championship run. So a solid performance from him. And by the way, Donald Cerrone, pulled groin and staph infection a month ago, looked pretty fucking good. I really expected him to look a little more beaten up and kind of haggard, and that may be the best he's ever dealt with a fast start from an opponent in terms of surviving and working his way into the fight within the same round.
I think that was the best technical version of Donald Cerrone we've ever seen, period.
Yeah,
I think that was one of the best performances of Donald Cerrone's career, win or loss, that we've seen from him. I thought that was much better in kind of the aggregate than what we saw from him in the Matt Brown fight. Where he also had some troubles. I think that this was the best. I think this was the best Cerrone.
Yeah.
For guys like Cerrone and Lawler at this point in their careers, frankly, wins and losses are not that important.
Yeah.
They don't matter that much. Like, neither guy, I don't think, is going to be winning a title again, or even maybe contending for a title at this point.
Lawler seemed to accept that even in his post-fight interview. He was like, I don't want to talk about where I stand in the title picture. I'm going to go home and see my family.
Yeah, I don't think Lawler really cares all that much. I don't think he would turn down the belt.
Sure.
But I think at this point he wants to go out there and make $500,000 to have a good, entertaining, and a fight that's compelling to him too. Like, he strikes me as a dude who wants to be interested by the matchup, like in some way. Like, he's not the kind of guy who's going to go out there and give like really complicated technical interviews, but like, I think he is such a veteran and such a smart fighter that I think he wants to have something to think about.
Maybe that'll be Bryan Ortega that day. Maybe it's the same kind of mindset, essentially, and Robbie Lawler's just the matured version. Because after his win, Ortega said, he quoted Helio Gracie, he said, if I'm going to lose, I want to find out how. Which is kind of like an interesting martial artist's approach to fighting professionally. Like, I want to go out there, I'm interested in the fights. Like, I want to see what they look like and all the different opponents I can face and how I can beat them or how they might beat me. And that's maybe the place, along with like guys like Anderson Silva, where Robbie Lawler is right now. And I'm cool with it. I like it. I'd like to see Robbie Lawler, just enjoying learning to fight as an older version of himself. Sounds good.
Yeah. And Cerrone, like, no shame in that. Cerrone is going to be fine.
Yeah.
Cerrone's going to do like that. There was no reason to watch that fight and be worried about Donald Cerrone's future.
Yeah,
like,
and
that was a great fight, a great performance from both guys. I think the smartest, most technical, most complete performances of both guys' careers in a long time. Like, I think that's something I want to see more of. I want to see more of both of that, that version of both of those guys. But so you mentioned Bryan Ortega. Connor, what did you think of his fight with Renato Moicano?
It was fucking amazing. It was such a good fight. I really enjoy watching Renato Moicano fight. I know Bryan Ortega's the A side in terms of action in this matchup. I love how quickly Renato Moicano has become a very capable mid-range boxer and a long-range boxer too. The speed with which he identifies openings for his counterpunches, the quickness and non-telegraphed nature of his jab, his footwork, the way he keeps his back off the cage as often as he can. And meanwhile, Bryan Ortega comes in here, still inconsistent, still not perfect, still some big technical gaps. The fight did become, at one point, the fight I thought it would become, which was Ortega not having Moicano's discipline, Moicano basically figuring out that he should just maintain distance and let Ortega chase him, and Ortega not having the same, cold, scientific style of Moicano consented to that. He went after him and got beat up a little bit in the middle of the fight. But also, when he was on, the defense he was showing, the counter punches, the lever punching with his right hand, going wide right to the body, uppercut up the middle, right hook around the side as Moicano pivoted away. We're still seeing Bryan Ortega flashing some really impressive shit in his fights. And it's just, he is like a Yoel Romero. It's very difficult to get a read on how he's going to match up with anybody because you kind of see the best and worst of Bryan Ortega in every fight.
He is really, really, really fucking talented.
Yeah.
Really talented.
Yes.
I don't think I realized how talented he was in terms of, the jumps that you see from him from fight to fight, in terms of, it's always something. There's always something new.
Yeah.
He's nasty on the ground. He's one of the most dangerous grapplers in the sport right now, I think we'd have to say.
He's on that Charles Oliveira level of, he will just shock really good fighters with his jiu-jitsu.
Exactly. I mean, but not inconsistent in the way that other really sub-first guys are.
Yeah.
He's real technically sound, really strong hips, and just incredible killer instinct when he grabs something. But on the feet, I expected Moicano to shoot him up, and Moicano landed a lot of shots. Moicano did a lot of damage. I did not expect the kind of basic fundamentals that Ortega was showing in terms of keeping his legs rooted, keeping his torso moving, keeping his head moving. That was good organic defense and head movement. Is he there yet? No, he's absolutely not there yet. And nobody is going to say that he is, but he's also still learning. He's still growing. He's still getting better. This is a dude who could turn into, he's either going to be an incredible and reliable action fighter, or he could be a genuine contender in a division that's that's kind of ready for some turnover at the top.
Yeah, this was kind of a fight that let us see, I think, two guys who are maybe going to be in that title picture, or at least in that upper top 10 picture within the next few years, and will probably stay there for a while. I think Moicano comported himself really well. I thought he was, there was a chance that he was still going to win this fight at the point at which he got submitted. And Ortega continues to show, even if in just brief glimpses sometimes, new skills with every fight. I knew coming into this that, I remembered Ortega's fight with Clay Guida and how good his jab looked when he realized he was going to have to use his reach, how nice he was with his timing and his distance management when he was reacting. And I thought what might happen in this fight is that he just wouldn't, once he lost the mental, the staring match with Moicano and decided I'm going to chase after him, that then Moicano would get into the fight. But Ortega did not let it slip away. He did not give in fully to that urge. He came back to what worked so well in the beginning. His jab, his great upper body movement, and beautiful body punching. Really nice variety in his combinations. And then, he's not sub first. He's sub last. He is the Yoel Romero of submission grappling. Something happens, and then round 3 rolls around, and he just takes your neck. It's pretty crazy. But you cannot give Ortega, that's an aura that really helps people like Ortega. People who fight him now will think, at any moment, he could submit me. I can't afford to go to the ground with him. And it's going to take somebody who's so confident in their ground game that they're willing to out-grapple, or if they even can, Ortega to actually beat him, I think. Because having that aura of fear in his back pocket, it's like a puncher's chance that has been proven many times, and people know it. Opponents know it. So I think people are going to be really anxious about his wrestling and his jiu-jitsu going forward, because round 3 rolls around, and you tap out when you're fighting Bryan Ortega. It was a really fun fight, by the way. Basically, for the first 10 minutes, a boxing match with a surprisingly, as Dominic Cruz pointed out, a very close distance. And those are my favorite fights. Two guys who know their range. They're standing relatively close to each other. And it was good to see Moicano, after a very disciplined but not necessarily exciting win over Stevens, change things up in this fight and decide I need to be closer and put it on Ortega to get him into my kind of fight. So loved it.
Both really talented guys. I think they're going places in this division.
Yeah, I agree. Volkan Oezdemir was at the top of the main card, and most unlikely title run to the title ever. Unimpressive split decision over OSP. Impressive because he got it at long odds, but not a good-looking fight. Shocking and bizarre knockout of Misha Serkinov. Less bizarre this one, but just as shocking. Don't clinch with Volkan Oezdemir, as it turns out. Apparently the dude hits really fucking hard in the clinch and is very dangerous with short punches. And he just keeps doing it. Like, I don't know. Do I have to, like, talk about Volkan Oezdemir as being one of the best light heavyweights in the world now? Doesn't that feel very strange?
I have no idea what to make of Volkan Oezdemir. So I think that we all knew on some level that Jimmy Manuwa was maybe not the dude. I think his chin has been an issue in the past. I think that we could be fairly certain that that issue wasn't going away. He was an older guy to start with, but I did not expect it to look like this. You know, I don't know how much there is actually to take from this, and I don't know how much we can take from Oezdemir as a whole.
How much can you take from any of his fights? That's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, you know, at this point, I'm kind of like, fuck it, just throw him in there. Let's see what this looks like. I have no burning desire to see Jon Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson too. And if Jones isn't going to fight Brock Lesnar, which I would also love to see, then let him go in there and do his thing against Oezdemir. That's an interesting matchup, especially with Oezdemir's low kicking ability.
Yeah,
like. He could go out there, and now I think we can tell, like, if you're going to beat Jon Jones, you need to finish your combinations with low kicks, and Oezdemir can do that really well. So
he also seems very difficult to cow, like, against a big name, big moments, big opportunities, unexpected. He's just like, he just has this blasé look on his face while he's doing everything, and then he wins, and he's like, I guess I hit pretty hard. You know, like, that might be useful against Jon Jones, just to be unshakable. That is a
Henry Hooft fight, is what that is.
Yeah, just be unshakable.
I mean, in the best way.
Yeah, unshakable. I do want to say, before we move on, because obviously with a 42 seconds fight, there's not a ton to glean from it. I did find it strange that Jimmy Manuwa opted to clinch with Oezdemir. I know Manuwa is a pretty good clinch fighter, but that is one of Oezdemir's better ranges. Even before the UFC, we would see him landing good knees and short punches in the clinches. Whereas at range, because he's not as athletic as Manuwa, the only thing he has that is like equal to Manuwa are kicks. Oezdemir is very dexterous, surprisingly dexterous and quick with those big thick legs of his. But you would have thought that Manuwa would have wanted to steal single power shots at range, right? Not push Oezdemir into a clinch within the first 30 seconds of the fight. I don't know. Maybe it was just me. It seemed like a strange tactical choice.
I think Manuwa likes to impose his physicality because he's bigger and stronger and more athletic. I think he really likes to make sure his opponents know that. And because part of what allows Manuwa, who is not a great long-distance fighter, and he's not really all that diverse in the pocket either, part of what allows him to maintain the distance where his power really tells is making guys afraid of coming inside on him.
Right.
Because he's not a great wrestler. He's a pretty decent wrestler, but he's not a great wrestler.
Yeah.
So he needs to do something to make sure that guys know that you can't just bully him. Like, Manuwa is a bully. He needs to be the bully in a matchup in order to make that work. That's kind of my take on it.
Yeah. Well, lesson learned for Jimmy Manuwa, or at least for people who studied this fight, if you're going to clinch with somebody who likes to throw punches in close, you got to control the posture or control their hands, or both. You can't stand there with somebody standing up straight with clear view of what's going on against the fence and an arm free to punch. You know what I mean? Like, whether it's head control, pushing their head back, yanking it down with a collar tie, inside control on both of the biceps, you got to do something to take away that guy's ability to just freely hit you while you're occupied holding him in place, because that's an exchange that you're not going to win. So, Volkan Oezdemir, number one contender for the light heavyweight title, and I could not be happier about that. And what would be the perfect icing on the tragic cake of Jones beating the best version of Cormier? It would be Volkan Oezdemir knocking Jones out in round one, and now it's going to happen. So, cannot wait for that. I actually am on the Oezdemir train, even if I don't know where it's going or what it runs on or who else is on it with me. I'm jumping on the train as it goes over the cliff, with Oezdemir just sort of half-liddedly steering it as the conductor. Let's talk about Ricardo Lamas and Jason Knight. Ricardo Lamas, another person I would compare some of the things they showed to Daniel Cormier. The pocket boxing of Ricardo Lamas was on point in this fight.
The second that he started throwing, he threw at Knight threw back, and then Lamas threw back, and then he kept throwing. I'm like, oh, the fight's over.
Yeah,
because when Lamas smells blood, the fight is over.
Oh yeah.
If you let Lamas get into a spot where he thinks all I need to do is keep pouring it on, the fight is over, and the referee should have been ready to stop that much earlier than he did.
Yeah, cool. Because Lamas isn't it should have been an earlier stoppage, but Lamas is clearly not the best guy in his division. But in a sense, he might be the most dangerous. Lamas, more than any other featherweight, will take a single opportunity and turn it into a finish consistently. That's what he does.
Do you remember what he did to Eric Koch back in the day?
I was talking about it just before the fight, the pool of blood in Eric Koch's eye socket as Lamas was beating his ass on the ground.
Dude, that was brutal.
Scary
and that is Ricardo Lamas. What he did to Jason Knight was Ricardo Lamas.
Yeah.
If you give him opportunities, and maybe we should have seen this beforehand. I think we had the dynamic of this fight fairly well. Knight is a guy who is willing to get in there and bang with you. He was going to give Lamas opportunities, and I guess we should have been clearer that if you give Lamas opportunities, he's probably going to finish you.
Yeah, and as it turns out, I basically am picking Knight in this fight. I think my feeling was he's made some really astronomical improvements. I'm hoping that for this really big opportunity, he called Lamas out. I got the feeling he knows he's getting better at an incredible rate. I'm expecting to see more new stuff here. As it turns out, I'm sure Knight wasn't any worse tonight than he normally would be, but as it turns out, the boxing defense of Jason Knight is really predicated on him being in open space and backing you up. It's really predicated on the fact that he has very quick hands and a surprising amount of power, and people don't want to stand in the pocket with him. The moment Lamas put Knight's back against the fence, and layered an exchange, as you said, threw, responded to a counter, and then responded to that with a counter of his own and kept throwing, Knight's defense against the fence was dog shit. I mean, let's be honest, let's be frank. He did not know how to avoid those punches when he didn't have the option to create space and move away from them. He didn't have head movement or angles. He didn't, it would have saved Knight's life maybe if he had just stepped in and grabbed Lamas instead of standing there and trying to swing back. Just hold him, smother him, make it so he can't keep hitting you. As it turns out, if somebody's going to beat Jason Knight, or if Jason Knight's going to contend, I'm going to have to see a fight in which somebody tries to pressure him against the fence and he gets his back off and gets back to his range. If he can't do that, I think that's really the hole that Lamas took advantage of. But Lamas is boxing, man. The combinations, the way he was bending his knees and getting low, that first right hook he landed after going to the body with 3 punches and then popping up with another Frazier-esque punch in that right hook, just vicious. And Knight was wide-eyed, glassy-eyed for the rest of the fight. At that point, he was just out.
Dude, I mean, Lamas is really good.
Yeah,
he is. We talked about this a little bit last week, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But Lamas is not necessarily a guy whose game really clicks with the way that we think about fights, which is not a problem with Lamas's game. It's probably a weakness in the way that we think about fights. Because I think you and I both like replicable process, and Lamas is not necessarily that guy. But at the end of the day, if your talent is being really, really good at smelling blood and finishing fights, that is, to some extent, a replicable process.
Right, and he can turn that into, that turns into, in a lot of his best performances, a different and very clear process for each different opponent. Lamas is a very adaptable guy. He's remarkably good at fighting to his opponent's weaknesses, using that killer instinct in the best way he knows how, which is by putting his opponent in this fight. What he did was put Knight in a position where if he got hurt or slipped up, Lamas would be absolutely ready to capitalize. And he did. So really impressive from Lamas. Knight has a little work to do, but there's nothing to worry about. Guy's 24 years old. Has some really big wins under his belt. Looking forward to seeing him back and hopefully with having worked on some of that boxing skill. Speaking of impressive striking, how about Aljamain Sterling? We'll run through these pretty quickly, but Aljamain Sterling over Renan Barão. First thing I want to say about this fight, Sterling looked great. The improvements in the boxing we saw in his last fight blended back in with more of his kicking game, blended in with his wrestling. I thought that after round 1, after he was taken down, Sterling looked phenomenal. He didn't slow down in round 3 either. He looked perfectly conditioned and composed, but even just going down 5 pounds, I felt like Renan Barão looked awful. I felt he looked like he did in that Mitch Gagnon fight after the first Dillashaw loss, and not at all how he looked in what I thought was a very composed and in many ways impressive win over Philippe Nover in his last fight. I like Barão at featherweight. I think trying to go back to bantamweight, I don't think he's like a huge bantamweight, but that weight cut seems to take all the life out of him. He was just flat-footed, standing there still. I'm like, where was the mobile, quick Barão who like learned from the Dillashaw fights? Where was that guy? He didn't show up.
Nope. I think there's a strong chance that Barão was just washed.
Probably.
Like that he's just done as a top fighter, and that's fine. I mean, I think he's one of those dudes where we need to remember, like, he started fighting when he was 18. He's 30. He's been around for 12 years. Yeah. Most guys do not have really long prime years.
Yeah.
You know, like we've kind of gotten spoiled in the last few years by having a lot of really good fighters with extended careers. Most guys do not have that.
Yeah.
Most guys, their prime years last until year 10, year 11, year 12. And what you get after that is a kind of is decline. And I think Barão is declined. That doesn't mean that he can't have good fights after this. It doesn't mean he's never going to win again, but he is not the guy that he was, and that's not going to come back.
Yeah.
Like, he's not going to go on another run at the title at 135 or 145.
Yeah.
Like, guys have figured his game out. We know what his game is. And when his physicality has declined as well, like, and his ability to cut weight has declined, then this is what we're left with. He's not a bad fighter at all by any stretch. And I think that what Sterling showed us here, which I thought was really impressive, because I don't want to make this all about Barão, was that Sterling can find ways of making his fight, even in a rough stylistic matchup.
Yes.
Sterling doesn't have to take you all the way down to make his grappling game work on
Yeah.
you. You know, that's really impressive. That is hard to do for a guy who is really a specialist in one particular thing, where it really makes his hay in one particular area. You have got to be creative about finding ways to make that work.
Yeah.
And Sterling did that.
For a guy who came from the same college and the same team originally, Aljamain Sterling is finally starting to look a lot more like the mini Jon Jones that I think we kind of thought he might be. He's looking a lot more just like an all-round brilliant fighter. It was a great performance from him. Barão looked bad. I mean, the thing is like, I know Barão is not as good as he was before the Dillashaw fight. I think that's that's just a certifiable fact to me at this point. But like in the Nover fight, what made it so impressive to me, what I liked so much about it, is that Barão went in there. He showed off the new things he'd been refining, his angles. He used really good boxing, and he fought that fight brilliantly from a tactician's perspective, because his whole thing against Nover was asking Nover, what's your favorite shit to throw, and then taking it away from him. That was that whole fight, is him having a little bit of trouble getting his reads and then saying, show me your favorite 2 or 3 moves so I can come up with a half dozen counters for each of them, and then take over the fight. And that required like quickness, pop, movement. He didn't have it, man. Like, even in the first round when he should have been fresh, I thought he looked really diminished here. So really great performance from Sterling. He took a tough stylistic matchup and made the most of it and looked really good in the process, but also it is, I think, a strong sign that especially if Barão is going to continue pushing this weight cut, that he's not long for the sport. Very quickly, Calvin Kattar, 300 underdog. I predicted he would win, and I'm very proud of it because he looked awesome. And so too, by the way, did Andre Fili. Showed off a remarkable chin, great aggression, combinations. His jab was better than ever. Kattar is just a better boxer. Like, he had a better jab. He had a better sense of distance, better head movement. The defense really made a difference in this fight. I thought Kattar looked phenomenal. And like I said before when I mentioned him alongside Robbie Lawler, I like the high guard of Kattar. He turns, he moves, he takes angles. He makes it so that whatever you're throwing, he's going to put his guard in the path of your attack, and he doesn't rely on it for too long. Kattar never lets you, if he can avoid it, set up and throw a bunch of shots at his guard. He's going to use it to pick off 2 shots, take an angle, get away. That's how a high guard should be used. That's how you block punches and avoid damage without just making yourself a target or giving your opponent a static obstacle which they can then figure ways around. It was a great performance from Kattar. I'm really excited to see him, maybe make some waves in the featherweight division. And it's nice to see more like Mark Delagrati fighters. Kattar and Font both showing off some really slick hands in their recent UFC performances.
Kattar... one real quick note about Kattar. Mm-hmm. Kattar has been around for a long time. Like, he had his first pro fights 10 years ago. And he's now 29. He had like a 3-year break where he didn't fight at all. But Kattar fights like a guy who's really, really experienced. And I think there's no reason with him where you would need to hold him back. Like, you could put him right in there with matchups with top 15 guys. And that would be appropriate for him. Like, you need to build him. Either he has the skills at this point or he doesn't. Yeah. So you might as well put him in there with a Duho Choi if Choi comes back from injury, okay, or somebody like that. You're going to get fun fights out of it. You might as well put him on.
Kattar versus Korean Zombie. How fucking fun would that be?
Yeah, I'm sure we're not going to see the Zombie for a year and a half.
Oh, really? You think it's going to be that long?
His knee injury was real bad.
Oh man. Well, some people are still fighting. That's about it for UFC 214. Before we head it out, we wanted to just give you a few parting words on next week's UFC card. Obviously, we don't have time to really discuss it or break it down in depth, but it is UFC. Is this a Fight Pass card or a Fox Sports 1 card? FS1. Main event.
This is FS1.
Main event. I like this. On TV, give some flyweight contenders a main event slot. Build up the next challenger for Demetrious Johnson. Make it interesting in the way that Jon Jones' challenges are interesting by making someone at least a little bit of a rival to him. So we have Sergio Pettis taking on Brandon Moreno in the main event, and that's a pretty damn good fight. I mean, I'm actually quite excited to watch these two go at it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really, really good. I think the initial read on this fight, Moreno is a slight favorite. I think he's minus 160 over Pettis right now. I think Pettis is going to have a lot of success on the feet early against Moreno. Yeah. But eventually, I think Moreno's a good organic striker. I think he adapts pretty well, and that could be a problem for Pettis as the fight goes on. But really, I think the bigger problems are going to come in the scrambles. Moreno is just a real vicious grappler. Really, really good, really sharp, technically sound, with great killer instinct, a great knack for finding your neck or getting to the back. And if we get some scrambles out of this fight, and I think we will, then I think that's eventually where Pettis is going to have some trouble. So I'm thinking like a round 3 or round 4 submission for Moreno.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I'm with you. I'm even going to double down and say that I would expect Pettis to really light Moreno up a few times in the first round. Pettis has one of the big things for him in recent fights has been him sort of discovering how much he likes to pressure people and like force them into the fence and make them throw and then just hit them with combinations. We've seen the speed and precision, but we've also seen, because of that more rooted, aggressive style, the power of Sergio Pettis. He's actually got some decent pop in that right hand, and also, like his brother, does not get enough credit for his chin. I know Pettis has been like stunned and knocked out a few times, but like in his John Moraga fight, for example, the dude was taking shots. He was not afraid. Even if his chin isn't as good as Anthony's, he's absolutely not afraid to use it if he needs to. And I think that Moreno is a bit of a slow starter, an opportunist in the mold of Lamas, but a bit of a slow starter, and that Pettis likes to start fast and give his opponents a strong impression early. But I agree with you. I think Pettis' ground game is kind of predicated a lot on like speed, agility, and surprise, especially when he's playing guard. And Moreno's, I think, is while very surprising, a lot more methodical. All the pieces are always in the right place, which means that basically when Brandon Moreno finds an opportunity to grab a neck or an arm in transition, it's a lot harder to slip out just by continuing the scramble than it is when Pettis does the same. These days, when Pettis throws up a triangle or a leg lock, people slow out. They're a little sloppy. They're too fast. They're not precise enough, his submission attempts, compared to Moreno's. They're good. Sergio's good on the ground, but Moreno really seems to be kind of a submission grappling phenom who is only now just coming into his own. So I'm looking forward to that one. The guy who wins will probably be the next challenger for Demetrius Johnson, unless maybe that TJ Dillashaw fight or Cruz fight or something big comes along, although at this point it's seeming like a distant possibility. Before we wrap up, I want to thank all you guys for tuning in. Thank you very much for listening this week, and I'm going to give Pat the chance to tell you what he has coming out this week.
I have a piece for Deadspin on Daniel Cormier about how his best just was not quite good enough to beat Jon Jones.
A very good piece, which I just read
thank you.
In the midst of recording our episode.
Yeah, if you're listening to this on Wednesday, it will have already been up for a couple of days, but check that out. Otherwise, I'm on vacation this week. I'm taking things a little bit easy. You, Connor, what are you writing?
That's the way to do it, man. I have an MMA Garage piece in the works that's going to basically, I think, look at the some fighters from the last 3 weeks of UFC events, little changes I would like to see implemented in their games to make them the contenders they could be. And then I have a video project in the works for this week, something looking back at UFC 214, but I don't want to make any promises as to when it's going to come out or, like how easy it's going to be. It's kind of a new style of technical breakdown I'm trying out for the first time. So I'll just say that look for a video project at some point this week. And other than that, that's pretty much it. We are now moving towards Pettis Moreno. The summer of endless UFC fights continues, although it's got to be said, this was probably the high point of the summer, and it's hard to imagine anything topping UFC 214 as a whole. Even with Woodley Maia in the middle, this was a great card. It was just great fights, tons of meaningful results, and big surprises, and complex storylines, and I just loved it. And I had a great time talking about it, and I hope you all had a great time listening to it. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything, compliments. We love compliments. Get at us on social media. Twitter is usually the best way. You can find Pat at Patrick_Wyman and me at BoxingBush, B-U-S-C-H. You can also find us on Facebook, although I don't think either of us use it as much as we use Twitter. Pat, what's your Facebook page?
Patrick Wyman MMA.
And I am Facebook.com/Connor Ruebusch MMA. So that's easy to remember. And until next time, if you all came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.